Ethan Cole. I know your case was fake.
Who are you?
Someone who can prove your wife set you up.
Your wife and a guy named Xavier set you up, and I've got the real evidence sitting right here to prove it.
And what's this supposed to be?
Marry me on paper and nobody can touch either of us.
Where do I sign?
The gate didn't creak. That surprised me. I always imagined this moment would come with some dramatic sound, metal groaning, chains dropping, something to match the 4 years I'd lost. Instead, it slid open in complete silence, and the cold morning air hit my face like a slap I'd been waiting for. 4 years. 4 winters in a cell built for someone else's crime. I stood there for a second, just breathing. Free air tastes different. It tastes like nothing, and after 4 years of recycled cell block air, that nothing is the sweetest thing you've ever known. Across the road, past the razor wire and the guard tower shadows, a black helicopter sat idling on a private helipad, its blades slicing lazy circles in the mist. I hadn't called anyone. I didn't have anyone left to call. My parents were gone before all this started. My so-called friends vanished the day the handcuffs went on. And my wife had helped put me here. So who was waiting for me? I walked toward the helicopter because I didn't have a better option. A driver in a dark suit held the door open without a word, like he already knew who I was. I ducked inside, and that's when I saw her. Samantha Black. I recognized her immediately. You couldn't not know that face if you'd spent any time reading business headlines. 34 years old, CEO of Blackstone Security, one of the largest private defense contractors in the country. She'd been on the cover of every major magazine that mattered, usually with a headline about her being the youngest woman to run a billion-dollar defense empire. What I didn't understand was why she was sitting across from me in a helicopter outside a federal prison, dressed like she was heading into a board meeting instead of a rescue mission. "Ethan Cole," she said. Not a question, a confirmation. Former Special Operations, convicted of corporate espionage and fraud 4 years ago. Sentence just completed. She said it like she was reading my resume, not my prison record. "You've done your homework," I said, sitting down across from her as the helicopter door sealed shut and the engine pitch climbed. "I did more than homework." She slid a thick folder across the small table between us. "I did the digging your lawyer never bothered to do." I opened it. My hands were steadier than I expected, considering what I was looking at. Financial records, wire transfers, a timeline. My ex-wife Chloe's signature next to numbers that didn't belong to her, numbers that belonged to the company I used to consult for, the company whose secrets someone had leaked right before I was arrested for leaking them. "Your wife," Samantha said, watching my face carefully, "and a man named Javier Reyes. They set you up. The evidence used to convict you was manufactured. I have the originals." The helicopter lifted off. Below us, the prison shrank into a grey smear on the landscape, and for the first time in 4 years, I felt something other than numbness crack open in my chest. It felt like rage waking up from a long sleep. "Why does this matter to you?" I asked. "You didn't fly a helicopter to a federal prison out of the goodness of your heart." Samantha almost smiled. Almost. "Because I need someone with your exact skill set, and the market for ex-special ops men who've been quietly framed and just released from prison is smaller than you'd think." She reached into her bag and pulled out a second folder, thinner, and set it beside the first. "There's a syndicate operating inside my industry. International. Dangerous. They've been laundering weapons contracts through shell companies for 3 years, and 2 investigators I sent after them are finished. I need someone who can move the way you move, think the way you think, and who has nothing left to lose. And in exchange? Full legal immunity, backed by my company's legal division. Resources most private citizens will never touch, a new identity if you need one, and the truth about what really happened to you, laid out for every court and every journalist who ever printed your name next to the word guilty." It sounded too clean, too fast. 4 years of nothing and now this, a billionaire dropping a second life into my lap 20 minutes after the prison gate closed behind me. But rage doesn't ask a lot of questions when it's finally been handed a target. And I had spent 4 years imagining exactly what I'd do if I ever got the chance to make Chloe and Xavier pay for what they took from me. "There's a catch," I said. I could feel it before she said it. Samantha slid a third document across the table. A marriage certificate. My name already printed on it, hers beside it. "There is," she agreed. "My board is circling. If they find out I'm funding an off-book operation using a convicted felon, they'll use it to force me out. But if that felon is my husband, protected under executive privilege, covered by spousal legal protections, untouchable by ordinary due diligence, nobody asks questions. It's clean, it's legal, and it gets us both exactly what we need." I looked at the paper, then at her, then out the window where the city was rising up to meet us, all glass and steel and morning light. 4 years ago, a woman I loved signed my life away with a lie. Now another woman was asking me to sign my name to a truth that could burn my old life to the ground and build a new one out of the ashes. I picked up the pen. "Where do I sign?" 20 minutes after walking out of federal prison, I became the husband of the most powerful woman in the defense industry, and I hadn't even landed yet. The helicopter landed on top of Blackstone Tower like it belonged there, like the whole building had been built around this one exact moment. I stepped out onto the helipad, my prison-issued shoes clicking against polished concrete that probably cost more per square foot than the house I grew up in. 60 floors below, New York moved like it always did, oblivious to the fact that a man who didn't exist an hour ago now controlled a piece of one of its biggest companies. Samantha didn't waste time with a tour. She led me straight into the executive suite, all glass walls and city views, and closed the door behind us like she was sealing off a vault. "You'll want to see this," she said, already moving toward a bank of monitors built into the far wall. "I told you I did my homework. That included your old life, not just the case that put you away." My stomach tightened. "What did you find?" She tapped a few keys, and one of the screens flickered to life. A satellite feed, high resolution, angled down over a property I hadn't seen in 4 years but would have recognized in my sleep. White colonial house, wraparound porch. The oak tree my father planted the year I was born, still standing in the front yard like nothing in the world had changed. My family's estate, upstate New York. My grandfather built that house with his own hands. "Blackstone runs a private intelligence network," Samantha said. "Satellite access most governments would finish for. I pulled property records the second you signed those papers. I wanted to know exactly what we were dealing with." "And?" She didn't answer right away. She just clicked to the next image, and the next, until I understood exactly why she'd gone quiet. The house wasn't mine anymore. "6 months ago," Samantha said, her voice careful now, like she was handling something fragile. "Your estate was sold to a shell company called Northgate Holdings. On paper, it's a real estate investment firm. In reality, it's a front." "A front for who?" "The Obsidian Syndicate." The name hit me like a fist to the chest. I'd heard whispers of Obsidian back when I still worked in defense consulting, an international network that didn't just deal weapons, but the kind of classified intelligence that could tip entire wars. Nobody I knew had ever seen their faces. Nobody I knew had ever lived long enough to try. "That's not possible," I said, even though the screen in front of me was proof that it very much was. "Chloe wouldn't have sold that house. My family built it. She knew what it meant to me." "She sold it," Samantha said flatly. "Her signature is on the transfer. So is her lover's." Another image filled the screen, a scanned document, property transfer paperwork, and there it was, in black and white. Chloe Cole. My wife's name, still carrying mine even though she'd spent the last 4 years destroying everything I'd built. Beside her signature, another name, Xavier Reyes. I felt my jaw tighten so hard it ached. They didn't just steal my money while I was locked up. I said slowly, piecing it together out loud because saying it made it easier to believe. They stole the one thing that couldn't be replaced, my family's home. And they sold it to the same kind of people who put me in prison in the first place. There's more, Samantha said, and something in her tone told me the worst part hadn't come yet. Before your family sealed off the study, your father hid something under the floorboards. I found references to it buried in old encrypted files tied to your original defense work, the same work that got twisted into your conviction. My blood ran cold before she even finished the sentence. A hard drive, I said quietly. It wasn't a question. I already knew. My father had shown me once, years ago, before any of this happened, a small compartment beneath the study floor, built into the original foundation of the house. He'd told me it held something classified, something from his own work decades earlier that the government had asked him to safeguard privately. I'd forgotten about it, buried it along with every other piece of my old life. It's still there, Samantha confirmed, encrypted, untouched, and containing what my analysts believe are classified national security assets tied to weapons contracts your father helped broker 30 years ago. If Obsidian finds it, they'll have leverage over half the defense contracts in this country, I finished. Samantha nodded once, sharp and certain. And that's not the worst part. She pulled up one more image. Construction permits, renovation blueprints, time-stamped just 2 weeks ago. Northgate Holdings filed for a full interior renovation of the estate. Structural work. They're tearing out walls, pulling up flooring throughout the ground level, starting with the east wing. She looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw something other than cold calculation in her eyes. Urgency. The study is on the renovation schedule for next week. The room felt smaller suddenly, the glass walls pressing in instead of opening out. 4 years I'd spent imagining exactly how I'd get revenge on Chloe and Xavier, imagining every version of the moment I'd finally look them in the eye again. Not once had I imagined this. That the woman who betrayed me had unknowingly handed a global crime syndicate the keys to a secret buried in the house I grew up in. A secret that could get people finished if it fell into the wrong hands. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It never really had been, not fully. But now the truth of it sat heavy and undeniable in my chest. I'm not just hunting down the people who ruined my life, I said, staring at the blueprints, at the little red line marking exactly where the crew planned to rip up the study floor. I'm racing a countdown clock against an international strike team, and the woman I used to love just lit the fuse without even knowing it. Samantha closed the laptop slowly, the glow of the screen fading from her face. Then I suggest we move fast, because in a week it won't matter whose house it used to be. It'll matter whose hands get to that drive first. Outside the window, the sun was dropping behind the skyline, painting the glass towers gold and orange. Somewhere upstate, my childhood home sat waiting, its walls hiding a secret that could burn everything down. Mine, Samantha's, and possibly a great deal more than either of us understood yet. I had 4 years of anger to spend. Now, I finally knew exactly where to spend it. 3 weeks of preparation had turned me into someone else. Samantha's people had built me a new face for the world, tailored suits that fit like armor, a manufactured backstory as a private investment partner, and a crash course in moving through rooms full of people who could smell desperation from across a ballroom. I hadn't worn a tuxedo in 4 years. It felt strange putting one on again, like wearing a costume of the man I used to be before prison stripped everything away. The Grand Palais glittered under Parisian evening light, its glass ceiling catching the last traces of sunset, while inside, waiters in white gloves moved through a crowd worth more money than most countries' national budgets. Xavier Reyes had built his post-Chloe fortune fast, funneling stolen assets into an art empire that let him launder money in plain sight, one overpriced painting at a time. Tonight was his biggest auction yet, and Samantha had confirmed through her intelligence network that Northgate Holdings' real owners would be here too, using the event to quietly finalize their next move on my family's estate. "Remember," Samantha said beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm as we moved through the entrance, playing the part of newlyweds perfectly. "You're not Ethan Cole tonight. You're my husband, a quiet, wealthy man who prefers business to attention." "I remember," I said. "Just keep Xavier busy long enough for me to disappear." She smiled at a passing photographer without missing a beat. "That part I'm looking forward to." We hadn't gone 10 steps into the main hall before I saw her. Chloe stood near the auction stage in a dress that probably cost more than everything I owned combined, jewelry dripping from her neck and wrists, jewelry bought, I had no doubt, with money that used to be mine. Xavier stood beside her, one hand on the small of her back, laughing at something with the kind of easy confidence only stolen money can buy. She hadn't changed. Still beautiful in that practiced, careful way, still wearing that same smile she used to give me before I understood it was a mask. Then she saw me. I watched it happen in real time, the colour draining from her face, her champagne glass slipping from her fingers and shattering against the marble floor, the sudden silence of nearby guests turning to stare. She'd built an entire new life on the assumption that I was gone, broke, broken, buried under a felony conviction with no way out. And here I was, standing beside one of the most powerful women in the world, dressed better than her lover, looking straight at her like she was nothing more than a stranger who'd spilled her drink. "Ethan," she breathed, the name barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. I didn't answer her. I let the silence do the talking, then turned my attention to Samantha as if Chloe hadn't spoken at all. It was a small thing, but I felt it land, the particular cruelty of being looked past by someone you'd once destroyed. Xavier recovered faster than she did, stepping forward with the smooth, practiced charm of a man used to talking his way out of trouble. "You must be the Blacks," he said, extending a hand towards Samantha, either not recognizing me or choosing not to show it. "Xavier Reyes, welcome to my little showcase." "Samantha Black," she said, shaking his hand with a warmth that was entirely fake and entirely convincing. "This is my husband. He has an eye for undervalued assets." Something flickered behind Xavier's eyes at that phrase, but he covered it with a laugh and gestured toward the stage, where a massive, abstract painting sat under dramatic lighting, waiting for the bidding to begin. "Then you'll enjoy tonight. I promise you won't be disappointed." Samantha slid her arm through his, effortlessly pulling him toward the front row, already talking numbers, already dangling the promise of a multi-million-dollar bid he wouldn't be able to resist chasing. It was exactly the distraction we needed. Chloe trailed after them, glancing back at me once with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fear, maybe, or something closer to regret. I didn't wait to find out which. I slipped through a side door marked staff only, moving the way I'd been trained to move years ago, quiet and unhurried, like I belonged exactly where I was. The hallway beyond led to a private office suite reserved for the gallery's owner, Xavier's temporary command center for the evening. The door was locked, but the lock meant nothing to hands that hadn't forgotten their old skills. Inside, the office was exactly what I expected. Expensive, sterile, designed to impress rather than to be lived in. A laptop sat open on the desk, still logged in. A satellite phone sat charging beside it, the kind used by people who didn't trust regular cell networks with their secrets. I worked fast. A small device from my jacket pocket cloned the data on his master keycard in under 30 seconds, the same keycard that would grant access to his private vault in Geneva, according to the files Samantha's team had traced. Another device, smaller still, clipped onto the base of the satellite phone, tapping its line without leaving a trace. Behind the desk, a wall safe sat half hidden behind a framed painting, but I left it untouched. Tonight wasn't about grabbing everything. Tonight was about planting the seeds that would let me take everything, later, on my terms. Through the thin office wall, I could hear the muffled roar of the auction floor, Samantha's voice cutting through the crowd as she pushed the bidding higher, keeping Xavier's full attention locked on a painting he'd never actually get to keep. I slipped the cloned keycard into my jacket, closed the office door behind me, and walked back into the ballroom just as the gavel came down on a bid Samantha had no intention of honoring. Chloe was still watching me from across the room, but this time I let myself meet her eyes for exactly 1 second. long enough for her to understand that the man she thought she'd buried was very much alive and coming for everything Xavier had built on top of the wreckage of my old life. Geneva in the rain looks like a city built out of glass and secrets. I stood beneath the awning of a private parking structure on the outskirts of the financial district, watching droplets streak down the concrete pillars, running through the plan one more time in my head. Samantha's analysts had confirmed it 2 days after Paris. Xavier kept a private vault beneath a nondescript office building here, used exclusively for meetings with Northgate Holdings' silent partners. Tonight, according to the tapped satellite phone, a transaction was happening. Money moving from Obsidian's accounts into Xavier's. Payment for services already rendered to the syndicate. If I could get inside that vault, I'd have proof linking Xavier directly to Obsidian's money. Evidence strong enough to unravel everything he and Chloe had built on the wreckage of my old life. I'd driven in alone. Samantha wanted to send a tactical team, but I'd refused. Too many people meant too much noise, and noise was the one thing this kind of job couldn't survive. The cloned keycard sat in my jacket pocket, waiting to open a door 3 levels below street level, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself believe this part might actually be simple. I should have known better. The first sign something was wrong came when I noticed the same black sedan for the 3rd time, parked in a different spot each time, but always angled the same way, always with its engine running. I'd spent years training myself to notice patterns other people missed, and this one screamed surveillance. Somewhere between Paris and Geneva, Xavier's satellite phone tap had been discovered. He knew someone had gotten inside his office, he just hadn't known who. Until now. I never made it to the vault entrance. They came out of the shadows between 2 support pillars as I crossed toward the elevator bank. 4 of them, moving with the kind of coordinated silence that told me immediately these weren't hired street thugs. Military background, trained, armed with more than just intimidation. The first one swung a baton toward my head before I'd even fully registered his presence, and instinct took over before thought could catch up. I ducked under the swing and drove my elbow into his ribs hard enough to hear something crack. He staggered back, giving me half a second to reposition against the pillar, using the narrow space to make sure I only had to fight one of them at a time instead of all 4 at once. The second man came in low, trying to take my legs out, and I caught his shoulder and used his own momentum to slam him face first into the concrete. 4 years in prison hadn't dulled what a decade of special operations training had carved into muscle memory. If anything, 4 years of watching my back in a place where violence could erupt over nothing had sharpened it. My body remembered things my mind had tried to forget. The third man was smarter, hanging back, waiting for an opening instead of rushing in. He came at me with a knife, a fast, diagonal slash aimed at my throat, and I twisted just enough to feel the blade whisper past my collar instead of through it. I grabbed his wrist, drove my knee into his elbow until the knife clattered to the concrete, and threw him hard into the second man, who was just starting to get back up. That left the leader. He was older than the others, calmer, watching the whole fight unfold like he'd been expecting it to go exactly this way. When he finally moved, it wasn't reckless, it was precise. A series of strikes clearly meant to test me, to find the gaps in my defense before committing to anything permanent. For a few seconds, we traded blows in near silence, nothing but breathing and the wet slap of shoes against damp concrete, 2 professionals reading each other in real time. I found the gap first. A feint toward his ribs pulled his guard down just enough, and I drove the heel of my palm into his jaw, following it with a sweep that took his legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard, and before he could recover, I had my knee against his chest and his own weapon pressed lightly against his throat. "Who sent you?" I asked. He said nothing, which told me everything. Professionals didn't talk, not for free, not under this kind of pressure. But his silence didn't matter as much as what was sitting in the inside pocket of his jacket, a slim leather case I'd noticed shift out of place during the fight. I pulled it free while he was still catching his breath. Inside was an encrypted flash drive, the kind used for one-time secure data transfers between people who didn't trust email or cloud storage. Exactly the kind of thing a courier working for Xavier would be carrying on a payment night like this. I left the four of them exactly where they'd fallen, groaning against the concrete, and walked back to my car without looking back. It wasn't until I was safely inside, engine running, streets of Geneva blurring past the rain-streaked windshield, that I let Samantha's tech team crack the drive remotely through a secure line. What came back confirmed everything and then some. Wire transfers routed through Chloe's charity foundation, the one she'd built 2 years ago under the banner of supporting displaced families, the one she'd used publicly to reinvent herself as some kind of philanthropist. Except the money flowing through those accounts wasn't charity money. It was Obsidian's laundering channel, moving syndicate cash through Chloe's foundation and out the other side clean, with Xavier taking a cut at every step. She hadn't just betrayed me for a thief, she'd become one herself. I stared at the numbers on the screen, watching 4 years of assumptions about my ex-wife collapse into something far worse than I'd imagined. And for the first time since walking out of that prison gate, the anger in my chest sharpened into something colder, something closer to certainty. Samantha's coastal estate sat behind a wall of hedges tall enough to swallow the ocean view from the road, the kind of place built to keep the world out. I'd been staying there since Geneva, sleeping in a guest wing bigger than the apartment I'd rented before all of this started, trying to piece together how to use what we now had on Chloe's foundation without tipping our hand too early. Samantha wanted airtight, I wanted fast. We hadn't fully agreed on which mattered more when the alarm on the perimeter fence went off just after 10 at night. I was in the study when her head of security radioed it in. Someone had climbed the seawall on the north side, avoiding the main gate cameras, moving with the kind of desperation that didn't belong to a trained operative. Samantha waved off the response team before they could intercept. "Let her come to the patio," she said, already walking toward the back doors. "I want to see this for myself." I didn't have to ask who her was. Some part of me had known this moment would come eventually, ever since Paris. Ever since Chloe's champagne glass shattered on the marble floor. She'd had weeks to sit with the knowledge that I was alive, protected, and no longer the broken man she'd left to rot. Weeks to watch her mercenaries in Geneva disappear off the map with no explanation. Weeks to realize the ground under her and Xavier was starting to crack. She looked different in person than she had in Paris. Gone was the polished gala dress and the careful makeup. She wore dark clothes, damp from the climb over the sea wall, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger and more frightened than I remembered her ever looking, even in the worst moments of our marriage. "Ethan," her voice cracked on my name. "I need to talk to you, please." Samantha stepped out onto the patio first, unhurried, settling into a wicker chair like she was hosting an unexpected but entirely unremarkable guest. I stayed standing near the doorway, arms crossed, letting the silence stretch long enough to make Chloe fill it herself. "You can't just erase me," Chloe said, her voice rising, panic bleeding into something sharper. "If you and your little wife think you're going to bury me quietly, you're wrong. I still know people. I still have contacts at 3 major papers, and if I go to them right now, tonight, I'll tell them Blackstone Security is illegally harboring a convicted felon. I'll tell them you're manipulating stock prices, using your marriage as a shield for whatever criminal operation you're really running. Do you have any idea what that story does to Blackstone's board, to your precious contracts?" It was a decent bluff. Desperate, but decent. The kind of threat that might have worked on someone without Samantha's resources standing between us. Samantha didn't even blink. "Sit down, Chloe," she said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her, with the calm authority of someone used to controlling every room she walked into. "You'll want to hear this before you make any more threats you can't actually follow through on." Chloe hesitated, some instinct clearly warning her that sitting down meant losing whatever leverage she thought she still had. But curiosity, or maybe fear, won out, and she lowered herself into the chair, spine rigid, eyes darting between us. Samantha pulled a small recorder from her jacket pocket and set it on the glass table between them. 4 years ago, Samantha said, a phone call was placed from a burner line registered to a storage facility outside the city. I'd like you to listen to it." She pressed play. The audio crackled for a moment before two voices emerged, distorted but unmistakably clear. Chloe's voice, younger, sharper with excitement instead of fear, and Xavier's, calm and calculating in a way I recognized instantly from Paris. "The files are planted. Once the investigators find them on his laptop, there's no way out for him. Ethan will take the fall for everything, and nobody will ever trace it back to us." "Are you sure this works? What if he fights it?" "He won't get the chance. By the time his lawyer even sees the evidence, he'll already be in federal custody." Chloe's face drained of every last trace of color as the recording played, her hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. I watched something break behind her eyes, the last thin illusion that she might still control this conversation collapsing in real time. "That's a recording of you and Xavier," Samantha said, switching off the recorder. "Planning to frame my husband for a crime he didn't commit, 4 years before he was arrested for it. That's not just fraud, Chloe. That's a federal conspiracy charge. Accessory to wrongful imprisonment, obstruction. I could go on." "Where did you get that?" Chloe whispered. "It doesn't matter where I got it," Samantha said. "What matters is what happens next. You have 2 options. You disappear quietly tonight and never come near either of us again. Or I hand this recording, along with everything we already have on your foundation laundering syndicate money, directly to federal prosecutors before sunrise. Either way, your version of tonight ends the same. The only question is whether you spend it on a plane or in a holding cell." I said nothing through any of it. I didn't need to. 4 years of silence in a cell had taught me the value of letting other people talk themselves into a corner, and Samantha had just walked Chloe into the tightest one of her life. Chloe looked at me then, something desperate and pleading flickering across her face, waiting for me to soften, to intervene, to be the man who'd once forgiven her for smaller things than this. I held her gaze and said nothing at all. She stood up so fast the chair scraped against the stone patio, tears already spilling down her face as she turned and half ran toward the sea wall the same way she'd come, disappearing into the dark like she was trying to outrun the sound of her own voice on that recording. Samantha picked the recorder back up off the table, turning it over once in her hand before slipping it back into her jacket. "That," she said quietly, "was the easy part." The call came in at 11:40 p.m., 3 days after Chloe fled Samantha's estate. Northgate Holdings had moved up their renovation schedule. Heavy equipment had arrived at my family's house that afternoon, and according to the drone surveillance Samantha's tactical team had quietly established over the property, a demolition crew was set to begin tearing into the study walls at first light. We didn't have 3 days anymore. We didn't even have until morning. "We move tonight," Samantha said, already pulling up a live drone feed on the tablet in the command vehicle parked a half-mile from the estate's back tree line. 6 of her people sat around us in tactical gear, quiet and professional, the kind of team that didn't need much explanation to know their job. Thermal shows 12 bodies on the property, 6 patrolling the perimeter, 6 inside doing prep work for tomorrow's demo. You'll have a window through the old service entrance near the kitchen, but it won't stay open long. I stared at the feed, at the ghostly outline of my childhood home, glowing in shades of green and white, equipment scattered across the lawn where my mother used to grow roses. Something about seeing it like this, reduced to a tactical objective, a target with entry points and hostile counts, made my chest tighten in a way Geneva never had. "I go in alone," I said. "Faster, quieter. Your team holds the perimeter and moves if things go loud." Samantha didn't argue this time. She just nodded once, sharp and certain, and handed me an earpiece. I crossed the tree line on foot, moving low through the same woods I used to play in as a kid, following a path that hadn't changed even though everything else about this land had. The service entrance was exactly where the blueprints said it would be, its old lock no match for tools that hadn't failed me yet. Inside, the house smelled wrong. Plaster dust and machine oil instead of the wood polish and fireplace smoke I remembered. Plastic sheeting hung over doorways, Tools and equipment cluttered hallways that used to hold family photos. I moved through the ground floor like a ghost retracing his own life, past the kitchen where my mother used to make breakfast, past the staircase I used to slide down as a kid, until I reached the study door. It stood half open, the room beyond stripped of furniture, exposed floorboards visible where workers had already begun pulling up sections in preparation for tomorrow's full demolition. I found the loose panel exactly where I remembered it, beneath what used to be my father's desk, and pried it up with a knife pulled from my boot. The compartment beneath was smaller than I remembered, dust-covered, but the hard drive was still there, wrapped in the same protective casing my father had sealed it in decades ago. That's when the radio crackled in my ear. "Movement in the east hallway," Samantha's voice said, tight and urgent. "2 hostiles heading your way. They must have picked up something on their sweep." I shoved the drive into my jacket, just as the study door swung fully open and a flashlight beam cut across the room. I dropped behind the desk frame a half second before the beam swept past where I'd been standing, my heart hammering against my ribs in a way it hadn't since the fight in Geneva. "Someone's been in here," a voice said in accented English, followed by the click of a radio and a burst of rapid foreign chatter. The window Samantha promised was closing fast. I came up from behind the desk and drove my shoulder into the nearest guard before he could raise his weapon, sending both of us crashing into a stack of construction materials. The second guard opened fire almost immediately, and the crack of gunfire tore through the quiet house like something obscene, splintering the old wood paneling my grandfather had installed decades ago. "Contact, ground floor," Samantha's voice snapped through the earpiece. "Teams moving in." I rolled behind an overturned work table as more shots chewed through the plaster above my head, then came up, firing a weapon I'd taken off the first guard, dropping him before he could recover his footing. Footsteps thundered through the hallways now, more voices shouting in multiple languages, the whole house waking up into chaos around me. There was one thing left to do, something I hadn't planned on using unless things went exactly this wrong. My father had installed an old emergency lockdown system decades ago, back when his classified work made him paranoid about home security. Heavy steel shutters built into the walls, designed to seal off sections of the house at the flip of a hidden switch. I'd forgotten about it until the moment I needed it most. I found the switch behind a section of exposed wall near the study, hit it, and felt the whole house shudder as steel plates began grinding down over doors and windows throughout the ground floor. Shouts of confusion turned to alarm as Obsidian's men found themselves trapped in sealed corridors, unable to reach the exits they'd used freely just minutes earlier. Through the study's remaining gap, I could hear Samantha's team moving into position outside, and in the distance, the first wail of approaching sirens. Federal agents, tipped off hours earlier by Samantha through channels she'd never fully explained to me. I slipped out through the service entrance the same way I'd come in, the encrypted drive heavy against my chest, just as red and blue lights began flooding the front lawn. Behind me, the house that raised me sat locked down tight, trapping the very people who'd tried to steal its last secret, federal agents already moving in to collect what the syndicate had left behind. I didn't look back at the house until I reached the tree line, and when I finally did, standing beside Samantha as agents led handcuffed men out through the front doors under the glow of flashing lights, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't expected. Not triumph exactly, something closer to peace. Blackstone Tower's boardroom sat on the 58th floor, all dark wood and glass, the kind of room built to intimidate anyone who walked into it uninvited. I'd never actually been inside it before, not in the official sense. Samantha had kept me carefully separated from the company's public face for months, exactly as planned. That plan fell apart the morning her assistant called both of us in a panic, telling us the board had called an emergency session for that afternoon. "Xavier leaked documents," Samantha said, reading through an email on her phone as we rode the elevator up, her jaw tight in a way I hadn't seen since Geneva. "Altered financial records, making it look like company funds were diverted to finance a private investigation. Your investigation. He's framing it as me embezzling shareholder money to fund a personal vendetta, using my husband as cover. Can he prove it? He doesn't need to prove it. He just needs the board scared enough to vote before anyone checks the numbers properly. The elevator doors slid open onto a hallway lined with framed photos of past company milestones, decades of Blackstone history staring down at us as we walked. The vote is in 20 minutes. If they strip my CEO title today, everything we've built the last 4 months becomes worthless. The immunity protections, the resources, all of it disappears the moment I lose control of this company. It was a good move on Xavier's part, I had to admit that much. Cornered after Geneva, after losing his mercenaries, after Chloe's failed blackmail attempt and hasty disappearance, he'd found the one weapon left in his arsenal capable of destroying us without ever laying a hand on either of us directly. Turn Samantha's own board against her. Let corporate politics finish what mercenaries couldn't. We reached the boardroom door with 12 minutes to spare. Through the frosted glass, I could see shapes moving inside. A dozen board members already gathered around a long table, voices raised in the particular tone of people who'd already made up their minds and were only going through the motions of a formal vote. "Wait here," Samantha said. "Let me buy us time." "No," I said. "We walk in together, right now." She looked at me for a long second, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, then nodded once and pushed the door open. The room went silent the moment we stepped inside. 12 board members turned toward us, papers scattered across the table between them, printed copies of the falsified documents Xavier had leaked. A grey-haired man at the head of the table, the board's senior director, I'd learn later, cleared his throat with obvious discomfort. "Samantha, this is a closed session." "It's about to become a lot less closed," I said, walking further into the room with 2 figures following close behind me. Federal prosecutors Samantha had brought in weeks earlier as insurance, folders tucked under their arms, badges visible on their belts. I'd insisted on this moment happening exactly this way, not through lawyers, not through statements released after the fact, in person, in this room, in front of every single person who'd been ready to believe Xavier's lies without asking a single question. I set the decrypted hard drive on the table, along with a printed copy of the intercepted ledgers from Xavier's satellite phone tap, the ones showing the true flow of money between his art empire, Chloe's foundation, and Northgate Holdings. "My name is Ethan Cole," I said, watching several board members exchange confused glances at a name most of them had probably never heard. 4 years ago, I was framed for a crime I didn't commit by my ex-wife and a man named Xavier Reyes, the same man who sent you the documents you're currently holding. Those documents are fabricated, the same way the evidence against me was fabricated 4 years ago. "That's a serious accusation," the senior director said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "It's not an accusation, it's evidence." One of the prosecutors stepped forward, opening her folder and beginning to lay out documents across the table. The same ledgers, cross-referenced against Blackstone's actual financial records, proving every dollar Samantha had spent was accounted for through legitimate legal channels. Nothing close to the embezzlement Xavier's leak claimed. "We've spent the last several weeks building a federal case around Xavier Reyes and his associates, tracing money laundered through weapons contracts connected to the Obsidian Syndicate." The second prosecutor pulled a final set of documents from his folder, and this time, I watched real fear ripple across the table. Names. Specific names matched against specific board members sitting in that very room, tied to shell accounts receiving payments from the same laundering network Xavier had been running. "3 of you," the prosecutor said, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be devastating, "have been quietly facilitating an illegal arms trafficking operation through this company's overseas contracts for the past 2 years. We have the wire transfers, we have the shipping manifests, and as of this morning, we have federal warrants." The boardroom door opened again before anyone could respond, and this time it wasn't Samantha's assistant. Federal agents moved in fast and efficient, and within minutes, 3 board members who'd been leading the charge to strip Samantha of her title were being led out in handcuffs, their protests swallowed by the stunned silence of their former colleagues. The senior director looked between the empty chairs, the scattered evidence, and Samantha, who stood perfectly composed at the head of the table she'd nearly lost minutes earlier. "I believe," he said quietly, The motion to remove you as CEO is withdrawn. Samantha didn't smile, not exactly, but something in her posture eased for the first time since we'd stepped into the elevator. She looked at me across the table, and I understood then that whatever this arrangement between us had started as, it had become something neither of us had fully planned for. Xavier had played his last card, and it had cost him everything. News travels fast when it's the kind of news powerful people want to distance themselves from. By the time we left the boardroom that afternoon, federal agents were already executing warrants across 3 states, and by the following morning, Xavier Reyes's name had gone from gallery openings to breaking news alerts. I watched it unfold from Samantha's office, the two of us barely sleeping through those first 48 hours as reports rolled in one after another. Federal marshals seized his primary gallery in Manhattan before noon, agents carrying out framed paintings and sealed crates, while photographers crowded the sidewalk outside. By evening, they'd frozen every account tied to his name, personal, business, and the dozen shell companies Samantha's investigators had spent months mapping. Northgate Holdings collapsed within hours, its assets, including my family's estate, placed under federal receivership, pending the outcome of the syndicate investigation. There's something almost satisfying about watching a man's entire empire disappear in real time, Samantha said, scrolling through updates on her tablet as we sat in her office late that second night, the city lights spread out beneath us like scattered embers. Though I imagine it's more than satisfying for you. It should have been. I'd spent 4 years imagining exactly this outcome, picturing Xavier's downfall in vivid, specific detail during long nights in a cell that never quite got dark enough to sleep properly. But watching it happen felt strangely hollow, distant, like reading about someone else's revenge instead of living my own. Chloe's collapse came faster and harder than Xavier's. Her name was on the fraudulent corporate filings tied to the foundation, the same documents proving syndicate money had moved through her charity for over a year. Unlike Xavier, who'd built layers of shell companies to protect himself, Chloe had signed things directly, trusting Xavier's assurances that her name would stay clean. It hadn't. Federal marshals froze her personal accounts the same afternoon they hit Xavier's, and without his money propping up the lifestyle she'd built since our divorce, there was nothing left to fall back on. The final piece of the story reached us 3 days later, delivered not through news reports, but through a quiet call from one of Samantha's contacts inside the investigation. Xavier was gone. He'd slipped out of the country less than 6 hours before the first warrant was issued, using a fake passport his old syndicate contacts had apparently kept ready for exactly this kind of emergency. No goodbye, no warning, not even a message to the woman who'd helped him build the empire now lying in federal ruins. He simply vanished, leaving Chloe standing alone in the wreckage of a life she'd destroyed her marriage to build. I felt something shift in my chest when I heard that part. Not sympathy, exactly. Something closer to recognition. 4 years ago, I'd been the one abandoned, left to face consequences alone, while the people who caused them walked free. Now Chloe was learning what that felt like, except she had far less waiting for her on the other side than I'd had. No estate, no family name to fall back on. No Samantha Black willing to pull her out of the wreckage with a helicopter and a second chance. The eviction happened on a Tuesday. Samantha's assistant mentioned it almost in passing, pulling it from a local news alert while briefing us on unrelated Blackstone business. Chloe's luxury penthouse, the one she and Xavier had shared during the height of their stolen fortune, had been repossessed by the building's management after months of unpaid fees drained straight into legal defense costs. Security footage leaked online showed her being escorted out by building staff, carrying only a single suitcase and a designer bag that would probably be the last expensive thing she'd own for a very long time. I didn't watch the footage. Samantha offered to show me, and I told her I didn't need to see it. Some part of me already knew exactly what it would look like. The same hollow expression I imagined I'd worn walking out of the prison gate months earlier. Except she had nobody waiting across the road with a second chance. "You could still end it here," Samantha said one evening, watching me stare out at the skyline instead of the paperwork spread across the desk between us. "Legally, you've already won, Xavier's gone, his empire is gone, Chloe has nothing left to threaten either of us with. You don't owe her anything else. I know, I said. But you're not satisfied. I turned to look at her, surprised by how easily she'd read something I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet. 4 years of anger had built toward this exact outcome, and now that it had arrived, I found myself waiting for a feeling that hadn't fully come. Justice, maybe, or something that felt complete instead of merely finished. There's one more thing, I said slowly. A gala, the Met, next week. Half the city's going to be there celebrating the takedown of an international syndicate, and Blackstone's going to be front and center in every headline. Samantha's eyes narrowed slightly, understanding forming before I finished the thought. You think she'll be there? I think, I said, that a woman with nothing left to lose and everywhere to be seen is going to want one last chance to make this about her instead of about the people she hurt to get here. I didn't know yet how right I'd turn out to be, or how public and desperate that final chapter would become. But standing there in Samantha's office, watching the city lights flicker below like the last embers of Xavier's empire burning out completely, I felt the shape of an ending finally starting to take form. One more scene left to play, and this time, I intended to be the one standing tall when the curtain finally came down. The Metropolitan Museum glowed against the night sky, its marble steps lined with photographers and reporters, all of them waiting for exactly the kind of moment tonight was designed to deliver. Blackstone Security had gone from a company nearly torn apart by scandal to the name behind one of the biggest international syndicate takedowns in a decade, and every major outlet in the city wanted a piece of the story. Samantha and I were the story, whether either of us had fully planned on it or not. I stood at the base of the steps in a tailored black suit, Samantha beside me in deep emerald silk, and for a moment, watching the flashes go off around us, I let myself feel something close to satisfaction. 4 years ago, I'd walked out of a prison gate with nothing but rage and a stolen name. Tonight, I was walking into one of the most prestigious events in the city as the man who'd helped bring down an international crime syndicate, standing beside a woman the press had started calling the most powerful couple in New York. You're smiling, Samantha said quietly as we began climbing the steps, her arm looped through mine, cameras clicking around us in a steady rhythm. I didn't think I'd get here, I admitted. Any of this, alive, free, with my name actually meaning something again instead of a headline attached to the word guilty. You earned it, she said, every bit of it. We were maybe halfway up the velvet-carpeted steps when the security line broke. I heard the commotion before I saw its source, a ripple of alarmed voices and shifting bodies near the perimeter barrier, security guards suddenly moving fast toward a figure who ducked beneath the rope line and was sprinting up the steps toward us. Cameras swiveled in an instant, flashes doubling, tripling, every photographer sensing a moment too good to miss. Chloe. She looked nothing like the woman who'd shattered a champagne glass in Paris, nothing like the polished philanthropist who'd built a public image on stolen money and borrowed charm. Her hair was unwashed, pulled back carelessly. The dress she wore looked slept in, wrinkled and thin against the cold night air. Mascara streaked down her face in dark lines, and her eyes carried the particular wildness of someone who had run out of every option except this one. Desperate, public, humiliating last resort. She dropped to her knees directly in front of me on the red carpet, right there in front of hundreds of photographers, right there in front of every camera capturing the moment Blackstone's celebrated power couple arrived at the city's most prestigious gala.
Ethan, please.
Her voice cracked, raw and broken, carrying easily over the sudden hush that fell across the crowd of onlookers. Please, I know what I did. I know I don't deserve this, but Xavier lied to me. He used me. He left me with nothing. I have nowhere to go. They're going to arrest me, Ethan. Please, I still love you. I never stopped. If you could just help me with the legal fees, just enough to... She was sobbing too hard to finish the sentence, her hands reaching toward me, grasping at nothing at all, really, because I hadn't moved an inch closer to her. I looked down at her, kneeling on the same red carpet where reporters would soon write breathless headlines about power, betrayal, and justice finally served. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in this exact moment. Not rage, not triumph either, despite 4 years of imagining exactly this kind of reversal.
What I felt instead was a strange, quiet clarity. The last thin thread connecting me to the man I used to be, finally, fully cutting itself loose. She had chosen this. Every step of it. The affair, the frame job, the years I spent in a cell while she spent stolen money on jewelry and galleries, and a man who abandoned her the second things went wrong. Nobody had forced her hand at any point along the way. And now, kneeling in front of cameras that would broadcast this moment to millions of people by morning, she wanted me to be the one who softened, who forgave, who rescued her the same way Samantha had once rescued me. I wasn't going to be that. "You traded a loyal husband for a thief," I said, my voice quiet but carrying easily in the stunned silence around us, every camera catching every word. "Now you can pay his bill." I adjusted my jacket, feeling the weight of 4 years finally, completely lift off my shoulders in that single sentence. Beside me, Samantha's arm tightened slightly around mine, not out of possessiveness, but something closer to quiet solidarity, the kind two people share after surviving something together neither of them fully expected to survive. We walked past her without looking back. Behind us, I heard the distinct sound of federal marshals stepping through the parted crowd, their voices low and professional as they approached, the click of handcuffs closing around wrists that had once worn jewelry bought with my stolen inheritance. Chloe's scream tore through the cold night air, my name breaking apart in her voice as marshals lifted her from the carpet and led her away from the cameras that had captured her final, desperate moment of freedom. I didn't turn around. Samantha and I walked up the remaining steps together, into the warm, golden light spilling from the museum's entrance, into a room full of people who saw us now not as scandal, but as survivors. Somewhere behind us, Chloe's cries faded into the noise of the city, swallowed by sirens and shutter clicks, and a story that had finally, completely ended. 4 years ago, I lost everything to a woman who chose someone else over the truth. Tonight, I walked into the rest of my life without her, and for the first time since the prison gates slid open behind me, I didn't feel like I was carrying anything from that old life at all. Just Samantha's hand in mine, and whatever came next.